Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating geopolitical puzzle based on some recent expert analysis of the US-Iran negotiations. And, what we're looking at here is a striking paradox. On one hand, you've got an Iranian regime that is significantly weakened on the global stage. But on the other, it's still incredibly resilient and fully capable within its own borders. We're talking shifting strategies, fascinating historical echoes, and absolutely massive stakes for the people on the ground. Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of all this complexity, we're going to organize the source material into 5 key themes. First, the weakened but resilient regime. Second, the impact of the economic blockade. Third, diplomacy, bluster, and delusion. Fourth, the verification challenge. And finally, the people behind the politics. All right, starting right off with Section 1, weakened but resilient. The regime intact internally. Now, to really grasp what's happening right now, the source material anchors us with a timeline of some pretty critical historical touchpoints. We start with the 1952 British blockade, move to the Islamic Revolution and its constitution in 1980, hit the JCPOA nuclear agreement in 2015, and finally arrive at the intense, high-stakes negotiations of the present day. So, what does this all mean? Well, according to the analysis, while Iran's ability to project military power beyond its borders has really shrunk lately, the internal state itself, it remains highly capable and deeply rooted in this historical framework. A crucial point the expert makes here is that the regime hasn't actually changed its core identity. It's still a theocratic state, meaning priests rule in the name of God. And it's still operating by the exact same constitution put in place by Khomeini during the Islamic Revolution back in 1980. So despite all those external setbacks on the world stage, the foundational structure of the government is literally entirely intact.
And as you might guess, that intact structure has some pretty severe internal consequences. The source highlights that the state's repressive apparatus is still very much in power. You've got these maximalist hardliners completely running the show within the IRGC. Which brings us to a really grim reality for everyday citizens. The expert notes that the regime's absolute most potent power right now is its ability to crack down on its own people. Actually, there's this deep, prevailing fear among the public that the second external bombings or pressures pause, it's basically going to be open season on them from their own government.
Moving on to Section 2, the economic blockade impact. Let's look at the financial squeeze and what's actually forcing them to the table. So, the real catalyst for these current negotiations is the intense economic squeeze from the ongoing blockades. And this brilliantly illustrates the cyclical nature of history. The expert actually draws a direct parallel between the current blockade, where the regime is literally struggling just to pay its government workers, and the devastating 1952 British blockade of Iran. In both of these scenarios, the economy absolutely tanked, leaving the government in a state of sheer desperation just trying to keep the lights on. To put that into perspective and show you just how extreme these economic consequences can get, the expert shares this wild historical anecdote. Back during the 1952 blockade, things got so incredibly desperate that the government literally had to pay its workers in bricks. I mean, wow. It's an unforgettable detail for sure, and it really underscores just how much pressure an effective blockade can put on a nation's internal stability. All right, Section 3, diplomacy, bluster, and delusion. So how do they react when backed into this economic corner? Well, they use a tactic known as brinkmanship. The source defines this as pursuing a dangerous policy right to the very limits of safety before finally stopping. It's a classic strategy, an old trick as the expert calls it, used to try and turn the tables and push an agenda forward, especially when you're operating from a position of profound weakness. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast between what the regime says publicly versus what they're doing privately. Outwardly, they're engaging in what the source calls delusion as diplomacy. For example, they've claimed absolute control of a new maritime regime in the Strait of Hormuz. But honestly, that's widely viewed as pure bluster, giving the overwhelming military power of their adversaries. The internal reality, though, totally different. Behind closed doors, they're actually signaling an unprecedented softening of their stance, something the expert says we haven't seen since the JCPOA. It's almost like the weaker they get, the louder the bluster becomes, just to mask how willing they are to negotiate. Which brings us to Section 4, the verification challenge. If they really are softening, how do we actually enforce a deal? Well, the central hurdle of these ongoing negotiations is beautifully summed up by that famous Ronald Reagan quote, "Trust but verify." The expert relies heavily on this exact philosophy to frame how you have to approach adversarial nations.
I mean, you can negotiate all day long, but without a rock-solid way to verify the terms, any agreement is incredibly fragile.
In fact, the expert makes a direct comparison here. They look at the 1980s, when Reagan was dealing with the Soviet Empire, and compare it to the present-day approach of President Trump and Senator Lindsey Graham towards Iran. They call it a sort of Reagan 2.0. The philosophy is remarkably similar, right? You apply immense pressure to an adversary to force a deal, but you fully recognize that strict verification is the absolute key to making it work.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because history shows us that verifying agreements with Iran is historically really, really tough. They've built a clear pattern of evasion. Step 1. In the past, the regime has simply kicked inspectors out. Step 2. They've violated the established protocols of the IAEA. And Step 3. Even during the JCPOA agreement, the source notes there was a total lack of anywhere, anytime access. Inspectors just didn't have the right to walk in unannounced and see what was going on.
And because of those past verification failures, the expert delivers this really powerful metaphor as a warning. They say, they rise from the ashes like phoenix. The argument here is that without strict, unannounced, ironclad verification protocols, there is absolutely no guarantee the regime won't just quietly rebuild its capabilities and bounce right back to power. And finally, Section 5, the people behind the politics. It's so easy to get lost in the geopolitical chess match of blockades and brinkmanship. The crucial point is to understand the reality for everyday citizens. Iranians are caught in a tremendously difficult position right now. As the international community debates all these deals, everyday people harbor this deep, profound fear of just being forgotten, left behind to face that intact repressive apparatus we talked about earlier. Meanwhile, there's this lingering reliance and hope placed on unknown U.S. and Israeli intelligence operations that might be quietly unfolding within the country.
And that leaves us with a critical thought to close on. We see the historical parallels, the economic squeeze, the brinkmanship, but as intelligence operations quietly unfold in the shadows, and as new deals are negotiated at the table, what will be the ultimate human cost for the people of Iran? It's a really sobering question, and it reminds us that behind every single geopolitical strategy, there are millions of human lives hanging in the balance. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I hope it helped you unpack the paradox of power in these negotiations. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.